Hello, everyone. My name is Anjali Arundekar, and I am delighted to welcome you all today to the second lecture of our inaugural series towards justice of our wonderful new Center for South Asian Studies here at UC Santa Cruz. First and foremost, a big Diwali Mubarak to all of you. I know we have some cause for celebration, but things in South Asia continue to remain sources of great concern. It's my great pleasure to be introducing our speaker for today, Professor Manan Ahmed. But before I do so, I want to tell you a little bit about our center and also invite you to participate in our future talks and collaborations and become part of our online subscription list. Our Center for South Asia, unlike most other area study centers, is focused on questions of social and economic justice, broadly defined across temporalities and spatialities in South Asia. Now, instead of telling you a little bit more about what we do, I want to return to a tradition that's very established in the communities that I grew up in, and also something that we have tried to do here at Santa Cruz, which is that we begin every mehfil, baitak, guftagu with a short poem or nazam. And in this case, the poem that I've picked for today reflects the intellectual vision of our center, as well as the political, ethical, and capacious histories that our speaker is going to address today. So let me read the poem for you, introduce you to the speaker, and then the show begins. So the poem is written by Miraji, a queer South Asian intellectual Musafir who many of you know through the work of Geeta Patel, whose lyrical summonings as a mad, quixotic, rebellious poet who traversed the divided borders of India and Pakistan, challenging dictates of region, gender, religiosity, and politics. In a wonderful poem called Adakar, written in 1943, he writes, and I'll read the short fragment in Urdu first, and then the translation by Geeta Patel in English. So here we go. मैं एक मुसाफिर छतों पे दीवारों दर पे दहलीज पर बसीरा रहा है मेरा और आज रास्ते में आ गई तू ये तेरा पर्दा कि जिस उस पार मुझको दीवारों दर भी दहलीज भी छतें भी दिखाई देती है खाक आलूदा आगाही से. On roofs, along walls, and at doors, at the threshold, I nest or roost, find repose. If you come by this path today, then this becomes yours, your curtain, your screen, on the far side of which I glimpse walls and doors, thresholds, and even roofs, dust tarnished inside, smeared with ashes, bequeathed from a fire. When I thought about this series, I couldn't think of anyone more fitting to inaugurate our series, along with the speaker we had last week, Usha Iyer, whose wonderful talk will be up on our website. In terms of our vision was the work of Professor Manan Ahmed. I had the pleasure of reading Manan's work a year and a half ago when I was on my way to Pakistan and was reading his wonderful first book, The Book of Conquest, because I was looking for broader histories of Indo-Islamic intellectual traditions and was blown away by what I read. And in his current book, which he will be talking from, which has just been released, The Wonderful Loss of Hindustan, which I urge you to buy. This, like Usha Iyer's wonderful book, is the world premiere of his book. And we are, of course, delighted to host him. Manan Ahmed, amongst many things, he has multiple roles, but I will just speak about his academic roles today, is an associate professor of history at Columbia University. He is a historian of early modern and modern South Asia, and his work capaciously engages Indo-Islamic intellectual traditions and the relationship between text, space, and narrative. And I think in both books, I've had the pleasure of almost finishing with this new wonderful book. There is certainly a commitment to the longue durée of a Muslim past. And I can't think of a more fitting way to imagine a more diverse past than the one Manan's books describe, particularly in the kind of moment we live in. Now, before I turn it over to Manan, I just want to go over a couple of protocols, if you will. The first is I would urge you to turn on speaker view when Manan comes on. We will, of course, mute you and we will unmute you after the talk is done. If you have a question, please share it with me over chat and I will put you in a queue. You don't need to tell me what your question is. Just say, hey, I've got a question, and I'll put you in the queue and call on you. Now, we chose not to do this as a webinar because we want to see your lovely faces. We want to make this as intimate as possible. So if I could invite you to show yourself on your video when you ask the question, that would be lovely, so that Manan can also see all of you. And last but not least, I want to thank my South Asian collective here at UC Santa Cruz. We are a team, a very small but powerful team, particularly our two graduate assistants, Keshav Batish and Shruti Gokhale, and my comrades, Anidhi Mahajan, Mayanti Fernando, Vilashini Kupan, Madhavi Murthy, Junaid Sheikh, Dard Newman, Megan Murthy, and Megan Modi, excuse me, and many more. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Manan. Manan, it's all yours. And if you all could just sit back, raise a glass, and brace yourself for a wonderful, exciting journey.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Randekar, for this invitation, for giving me this opportunity. This is, how do I say this? This is my first book talk, probably ever. So I'm very nervous, even though the book is already done. But I'm also delighted and honored to be here. I'm honored especially because it allows me to think with the colleagues at UCSC, and in this world of Zoom, just globally, I see lots of familiar names in the participant, and I thank you all for joining. This is perilously close to my bedtime, so I might zone out at the end. But until then, it will be my effort to give you a glimpse of the book that I'm here to talk about. So I'm gonna turn on some slides. Bear with me for 1 second, please. I'm assuming everyone can see this because I can see it. This is a artist rendering of me during the last stages of the book proofing. So you can see the toll that this has taken on all of us. The best thing about Zoom is you don't have any audience reaction, so it really helps you just say whatever comes to your mind. So I want to kind of begin first and foremost with thanking Professor Arundhakar for this invitation, for Keshav for being so excellent and accommodating with setting up the Zoom. I want to thank all of the colleagues that were mentioned by Professor Arundhakar who have launched this great new center for South Asian Studies, and of course everyone who has joined us. I am here primarily to discuss the loss of Hindustan, but it's a rather difficult task for me to kind of think about how to talk about this book. Mainly because I think there's so much that is important to unsay when we think about Hindustan, especially in the moment that we're living and breathing in. That I kept coming up with like, oh, how about this framing narrative? How about that framing narrative? So I may change my mind halfway through and think out loud. But one of the ways we can begin as historians, I guess, is if we ask when and where was Hindustan. One thing is that nobody wanted Hindustan, the word Hindustan, in 1947. The Republic of India didn't want Hindustan, and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan didn't want Hindustan. The Republic of India began their constitution with India, that is Bharat shall be the union of state, or Bharat Arthat India Rajyon ka Sangh hoga. or Hind yani Bharat riyasaton ka ek union hoga. There was no recognition that Hindustan existed as a concept. Even things like the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, which was the association of Bhagat Singh, had largely disappeared from view by 47, as had the Hindustan of Ghalib or the Hindustan of some of the intellectuals that I want to talk about today. What remained and what remains, especially comes into view in 1992, is Hindu, Hindustan. And that tripartite kind of definition is more or less what we have with us to this day. Now, it's odd to kind of problematize this word. Let me take a couple of stabs at it. So, like I mentioned, very recently, you've had this kind of pushback especially from Tamil Nadu and from Kerala about the Hindification of India. You have some idea, for example, Hindustani classical music. This little blurb comes from Wikipedia, which is the art of northern regions of Indian subcontinent from 12th century CE. You have something like a Ganga Jamni Tahzeeb idea or decadent Muslim ruler idea that something like Satyajit Roy's Shatranj Ke Khiladi gestures at. And you have the kind of cluster of ideas which are to do with Hindustani, the language, and here's John Gilchrist that has to, that's the kind of the first grammar at Fort Williams. You also have things like ancient, so periodizations that come up. So ancient India, as you can see from that screenshot, has, I don't know, hundreds of books. Ancient Pakistan, not so much. Academics generally laugh at that. They like ancient Pakistan. And so, but the government of Pakistan, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is pretty keen on it, as you can see. Ancient Bangladesh, again, very few ideas of that antiquity. But ancient India seems to be unproblematic. So what makes ancient India unproblematic or even, completely unworthy of any extended comment, but ancient Pakistan and ancient Bangladesh, not so much? I think the easy answer is, of course, that one thing comes into being in 1947 and then in 1971. And the other thing exists from time immemorial, that is India. So that's sort of the, I guess, problematic that I began with when I was thinking about this. What was there to this idea of Hindustan? And if it had disappeared so quickly, how did it survive for nearly 1,000 years? What kind of role did it play in the organizing of place, of a history, of community? The difficulty that I faced in trying to answer this question was that it's very difficult as an intellectual historian to trace the erasure of concepts or the erasure of ideas, especially if erasures have happened gradually or there is a hegemonic or majoritarian truth that over determines a meaning. I mean, examples are plenty, but one can think of the name, quote unquote, name for the quote unquote America before Amerigo Vespucci, and how would we think about it? How would we label the continental shelf? And then how would we go about integrating it into our daily existence if we chose to do so, and if we chose to do this in the spirit of land acknowledgements that we even do? So it's not just the erasure of the concept, but also the erasure of a way of being that comes about when colonial languages supplant, overturn, and overgrow where the languages of the colonized used to live. So in that sense, the history of something that is not realizable as missing, cannot even be fully articulated, is a very difficult task to undertake. And because it's not just a task of kind of thinking back, as historians, going to our sources, but it's actually a task that has to contend with something I would call political forgetting. Political forgetting superimposes the present over the past, such that not just all the conveniences and prejudices of the present overshadow the complexities and lived-in realities of the past, but also that political forgetting is the very act of writing history. In other words, history writing, historical sciences, the methodology of history, history as a discipline are all extremely active players in the task of political forgetting. The political forgetting that this book explores is, as I mentioned, the idea of Hindustan. And what I'm interested in Hindustan is Hindustan as an object of historical study, both active and a passive subject of history study, and actually nothing to do with all the other ways in which I have just mentioned the word Hindustan survives or does not survive. So none of this is actually in my book if you're interested in these issues. What is in my book is, or what I'm interested in, is the idea of history writing itself. And I approached it with two perspectives. One was I wanted to study how Europe worked to erase Hindustan, its own practices of history writing, under the guise of a purported universalism, that is, the world history. It stripped Hindustan from geography and supplanted it with this other concept that we naturalize, which is India. This colonial episteme collected, archived, organized, excerpted textual and material forms to create this histories of British India and then later on India. And in these domains of knowledge, which extend from the 16th century onward in Portuguese, French, Dutch, German, and obviously British writings about the subcontinent, there is a project of making of India, which is a European project. It's not necessarily just a project of one colonial power, but it's a European project which understands global world history, not global, but world history in a particular way. And the metric of time and space to be argues in a very, very rigid formation. So one of the first things that happens with this idea of Hindustan is that it's concomitant or coterminous with the erasure, with the creation of the idea of India. So in other words, we can't talk about the erasure of Hindustan without talking about the creation of India, as again, the words. With this impulse, I started to kind of think of how to pick a end point to the period that I was looking at. I knew what I was going to start, where I was going to start, but where does one end in a project such as mine? And I ended up ending for reasons we can discuss, but they're not terribly profound. In a moment in the first decade of the 20th century, when Muhammad Iqbal writes Tarana Hindi, which was playing in the, I think Asha Bhosle's voice in the beginning in the waiting room, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, which becomes an extremely important Tarana, an extremely important song throughout the 20th century, all the way to 1947 and beyond. And Savarkar's poem, which is Priyakar Hindustan, Beloved Hindustan, which is written in 1908. These two poems have two very different ideas of Hindustan, and they're coming to fruition in 1904, 1908. And then what happens both to Iqbal's own ideas about Hindustan, his own idea about what constitutes a Muslim in the subcontinent, and to Savarkar's elaboration of his concept that he begins with here in London in 1908, and as he kind of develops over the 1920s. That erasure to Hindustan is not a story I go in, but this is the moment that I say is the end of Hindustan. So with that moment in the end, I wanted to see how do we kind of write a concept history of Hindustan from that moment backwards. What was the idea? How did it come about? What made it powerful enough to persist? And what role did it play, as I mentioned earlier? And part of it was to kind of think about this project of history writing itself, and how do I, as a historian of what I called in my first book, a post-colonized historian, how do I, as a post-colonized historian, enter into a conversation with the European philosophy of history in which the place of Hindustan, or more properly, the place of India or the Oriental world, plays a very specific role. So those were the kind of opening gambits, and what I decided to do, and I'll explain why, was to look at the loss of Hindustan, or look at, the Hindustan through the eyes of a particular gentleman named Farishta, Muhammad Qasim Farishta, who was able to crystallize this vision, this concept. And I argue that his history is one of the most important works of history writing itself, not just a history, but the works of history writing that comes about in the 17th century. And that this allows me to kind of think about just the project of history writing at the moment before colonialism, or at the same time as colonial powers are entering the Deccan and entering Western and Eastern subcontinent, and how we can kind of think with Farishta, both what antecedents Farishta had, the ancestors, the elders, the historians that he was reading, and then what happens to Farishta after the European incursions. Farishta, the author of a text called Tarikh-e-Farishta, but which he calls it Tarikh-e-Farishta, but it is also known as Gulshan Ibrahimi after his patron, or Norasnama after the ethics of what he wants to do, and sometimes Tarikh-e-Farishta or Shahnama. And those are the dates of this text. Here is Ibrahim Adil Shah, who commissions this history with a very specific ask. He says that there are histories of the kings of Hindustan, but there's no one single volume about Hindustan itself. And he asks Farishta to take up this project. And Farishta says he sets out to compile an archive of all of the histories that had come from before him, all of the accounts of the different parts that would constitute the whole of Hindustan. This is the sort of kind of the first couple of pages of the edition, a manuscript at Scotland. And what does it mean to write a history of all of Hindustan, and why is that important? Well, one of the, just briefly, the important part here is that a lot of the historical writing tradition either kind of takes that as a framework, its originary framework, a history of descent from God down Adam or other deities or prophets to the current political regime, the current king, their family, their ruling family, and then the polity that surrounds them. So the heavenly and earthly political powers and the geography that is associated with them seems to be the kind of natural way in which most historians, most attempts to archive the past seem to have happened. Farishta does something very differently. Unlike Abul Fazl, he doesn't write a history of Akbar, in his case, his ruler, Adil Shah II. Unlike Juzjani and other Persian historians, he does not simply do a history of ruling families. What he does is that he gives you a history of different constitutive parts of Hindustan in a particular order. And within those parts, the ruling elite and the people who lived in these polities, and some of the customs in those polities, some of the kind of cultural histories attached to these polities, alongside sort of a general rumination on Hindustan as a whole. And that's what made this text quite unique. And so this project, then my project, began with this idea to identify Farishta's Tarikh as the fullest history of Hindustan. And I'm sure my Mughal historian colleagues will quibble with me, and I appreciate and welcome their quibbles. And other colleagues will also quibble with me, but this is my fate. I make these arguments, we all do. So this is the argument that Farishta's Tarikh is the fullest history of Hindustan. And then once we get over that hurdle, however we get over that hurdle, then, a very basic types of intellectual history questions. What did Farishta read to write this history? How did he put peoples and polities together? What was where and how? And then what was the life of the text? So it was, once the conceptual work was done, I was able to kind of move rather quickly into thinking about Hindustan. But in order to kind of convince the audience that's listening that Farishta's Tarikh, you may or may not have heard of, is indeed the text that allows us to unlock something called called Hindustan. I have to give you a little bit about how Farishta enters European philosophy of history. And for that, we have to thank this gentleman, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Dow in the East India Company. Those of you who've read your Ranajit Guha or your Partha Chatterjee or your Ramila Thapar would recognize this gentleman. He says in his rendition of Farishta that to translate some piece of history was by his teachers recommended to him as a proper exercise in the Persian. The works of Muhammad Qasim Farishta of Delhi, he's from the Deccan, but sure, who flourished in the reign of Jahangir, about the beginning of the 17th century, was put into his hands for that purpose. So this is the kind of taking up of Farishta by Dow. And if we want to kind of say, well, is Dow's impression that this text is important correct or not, we can kind of fast forward 70 years, 80 years, in fact, and look at Eliot's bibliographical index to the historians of Muhammad in India, where he says the history of Farishta is universally known in India, at least by name, and there are few large towns without a copy. He knows this because he's going town to town collecting copies. If we add to these works labeled Narusnama and Tarikh Ibrahimi, which few of the present ignorant generations, that would be us colonized folks, know to be the same as Farishta history, we shall find that it is probably more common than any secular work of equal size in this country being British India. So we can see that not only was Dow correct in kind of getting a hold of this text, but the spread of the text continues into the next century. What does Dow do? He does a rendition in 1768, the history of Hindustan, from the earliest account of time to the death of Akbar. Not that important. I mean, the rendition is not that important, but what is important is the appendix, a dissertation concerning the religion and philosophy of the Brahmins, very, very important for the history of religion, in fact, as a field, with an appendix containing the history of the Mughal Empire from its decline in the reigns of Muhammad Shah to the present times. Again, very important for the argument that East India Company will be making. And this is the kind of map that came with the first volume, a map of Hindustan. I like this particular map just because it breaks Hindustan into this. Then he has a subsequent volume in 2 volumes, which is the history of Hindustan, in which he kind of adds on to the first volume, and in 1772. And these volumes are almost immediately translated into French and German. And 1772, 1773, and then taken up by Voltaire for his comments on his project for writing a universal history. So it's quite rapid. So Hume, who Dow knows personally, sends a copy to Voltaire, and so on. It kind of spreads throughout Europe. The text itself, outside of Dow, continues to be of importance. So there's some criticism that Dow didn't do a very good job. So there's Jonathan Scott, also one of the founding members of the Royal Asiatic Society, also part of Hastings group. He then takes a stab at rendering some portion of the Farishta's text. Then you have Briggs, who basically kind of tries to do a rendition of the entire account. And we can also trace the presence of manuscripts, Farishta's manuscripts, throughout Europe. So we have Berlin, the British Library, the Museum, Cambridge, Oxford, Manchester. I don't even have that on here. I'm sorry. Scotland, Bibliothèque Nationale, etc. So you can also see how the manuscripts of the text were actively collected. So I want to, at this moment, kind of tell you, so this is kind of, why Farishta part. Now I want to say a little bit about how the book, I try to organize the book itself. And that's this way. Um, Look at that cake. And this was an effort to kind of think about methodology a little bit more than I had been able to do in my work so far. And the methodology being, how do I, as a historian trained of the medieval or early modern period, how do I think about that period when the colonial and the post-colonial was the kind of domain of the modern historians? And is that something even I want to do? After all, I studied texts that were written long before colonialism came. So why should I pay attention to what happens during the colonial period? And why I think that the idea for us to deal with the kind of impact of colonial archiving practices, colonial translation practices, colonial acquisition practices, colonial categorization practices, colonial practices of cataloging, of listing, of genre making. Why are all of this infrastructure of knowledge making somehow does not apply to me? That I can simply pick up a Persian text or a Sanskrit text or Arabic text and recede. And even though I pick this text up in the British Library or in the Bodleian or in Beinecke, whatever, I can imagine myself unfettered from the pull of the colonial episteme. And in my first book, I had talked about why, as someone who holds a Pakistani passport, I have never been able to imagine myself outside of my capacity to move through border regimes. In other words, the political personhood that is attached to me, the subjectivity attached to me, also oriented the type of research I could do, the type of writing I could do. And if that was the one type of impact of a post-colonized historian that I was able to think with in my first book, does the colonial practices of cataloging and archiving actually do to the texts that we think are somehow untouched, when obviously they are not untouched? And so with this, I wanted to, in this book, I want to argue for rethinking how we come and deal with the colonial period. I want to say that it's important for us to degloss this history, deglossing it by rethinking about periodization, source languages, the relationship to communities, but also deglossing by thinking about the ways in which manuscript cultures, manuscript studies is implicated in the regime of colonial accumulation projects and colonial description projects. So the order of knowledge system that remains in place has to be destabilized. One of the methodological ways I'm writing that destability is that my chapters are then arranged like this cake, where every chapter has a colonial episteme in the beginning, a Hindustani historians section in the middle, and then two Farishta. So overall, the book has these some of the main chapters of the book. The substantive ones that I want to talk about just today is just chapter 3 in archive, but which sounds, I think, hopefully very clear, especially drawing upon Professor Arundekar's work, but which is where I want to think about what constitutes an archive for Hindustan. But in the places chapter, which I won't go into it, I do think about the various types of peoples that are described in these histories, both colonial, pre-Farishta and Farishta, and then the spatial imagination. And so these chapters kind of deal with these themes, but in their structure of writing, they have this tripartite structure. And some of this is a book entirely, a book on history writing by thinking about historians mainly. And so some of the ones that I rely on most importantly are the Hindustani historians that came before Farishta. Everything from Mahabharat, which Farishta begins his text with and claims is the best history of Hindustan that exists, to Firdausi, Aufi, Juzjani, Isami, Khusro, etc. And then the kind of the colonial historians that Dow I mentioned, others I'll mention Eliot a little bit, and Springer. And then the Hindustani historians who come after Farishta, all the way into the 19th century that I also cover. So very brief taste of the kind of the colonial acquisition project, just because I want us to kind of have a sense of that and Farishta's role in that. So this is Henry Myers Eliot, who completes, who's known for the Complete History of Muhammad in India, published posthumously, but really it's this bibliographic index, which is a fascinating text. Not much attention has been paid to it. But what this text does is it brings and puts together a structure for how to write the history itself. What are the key texts? And actually what are the key texts to be accumulated? So here's his works that he says should be selected works for deposit in our college libraries, Fort William and the Delhi College, as well as in the imperial centers. Exhibiting a series necessary for the full understanding of the history of Muhammad in India. I won't go into the kind of periodization question here, but you see that Tarikh-e-Farishta is the first text that's listed. And then he begins this is Tarikh-e-Farishta, and then he begins with kind of the a discursive on Farishta, superior to all other general histories of India. His colleague, Alois Sprenger, was the principal of Delhi College and also writes a very important text. I spent a lot of time in catalogs when writing of this book, writes a very important catalog for Awadh. Sprenger is deputized by Eliot to do a collection project, which Eliot has kind of organized as a pan-Hindustan project, which is to ask for archives, intellectual centers, libraries, prominent houses, ask them to supply to him histories of Hindustan, whether they have it or not. So they have to do two things. They have to tell him the list of the top histories, and then whether or not they have those histories in their possession. And all of this needs to be mailed to Sarhani Eliot Sahab Bahadur Sarkar, Secretary Mamalik in Hind. So here's his the text he produces, and what he then basically lists is a titles that he wants, and he creates this kind of list of books that are divided in the lists that are needed or wanted, and lists that he has already acquired. This accumulation project then asks the various intellectuals, various historians, to produce a ledger, which this is the template for the ledger that is supplied by Eliot. And it says, you put your name of the author, how many folio pages, how many other pages, the writing, the date of writing, whether there's any faults in the manuscript, a full copy or not, and then the first sentence and a summary of the entire work. Here's a filled out template from Tata. Here's another filled out template from Lahore. And here's what happens to be the end of the accumulation period, which is these many catalogs. I have just highlighted the various parts of the colonial world that these catalogs end up in, and where these manuscripts began by Eliot find their home. Now, historians have paid attention to the looting of Tipu Sultan's library, the looting of the so-called Mughal library after 1857. But this project of accumulation hasn't really, I think, been integrated into how we think about the pre-European time, pre-colonial time period. So with that very sketchy and perhaps incomplete excursus, I want to kind of end with thinking a little bit about methodology with you, and also taking my cue from the series title, Towards Justice, and kind of thinking about what does that mean. How do we kind of think of it towards justice within the project of history writing, something that I'm engaged in. So I mentioned in my first book, one of the things that I was very interested in was kind of thinking through walking my experience of a contemporary space, Uch Sharif, in order to kind of think about this text, this 13th century text, Chashnama, that my first book was about. And one of the things that I noted in that book was that I had particular limitations, as I mentioned. The realities was that I could not actually go where my text was going. My text being, I'm sorry, in this very weird possessive way, but Chashnama was going. I had to stop at the border. I had to stop at the border in the Cholistan desert. I could not cross the border, even though the text crossed the border. Even though the imagination, the spatial imagination of the text could go there, I could not go there. And vice versa. A historian of India from India would not be able to cross over that border as well. And that creates a kind of a tension, methodological tension. And what I kind of began to think about as how to kind of think of India and Hindustan, that is the partitioned India and Hindustan, I realized that there was a way in which the historians who had written during the colonial period, in the nationalist struggle movement, anti-colonial movement period, were actually had an archive that I, as a historian, had never really thought about in a very specific way. I had gone to their writings in order to read what they had written on their particular specialty. These are all medievalists, if you're wondering. But I hadn't actually thought about how to think about Hindustan through their writings, through their work. These generation of Hindustani medieval historians had actually wrestled with the colonial episteme, whether they were in Calcutta or in Allahabad, or Aligarh, Baroda, Lahore, Pune. And what they had to kind of contend with was the ways in which colonial knowledge paradigm had shaped the study of the medieval. And I am someone whose paradigm is shaped by my nationalism, the nationalisms that under which I grew up. So I could see there was a lot of affinity that I felt for the project that they were trying to do, trying to resist colonial episteme, trying to think about the medieval past through this barrier of historiographic as well as hermeneutic barrier that was there. And so in order to think with these historians, I kind of dwell with them. And what happened was that I began to sketch out a methodology which had to basically grapple with the question of Muslim belonging, to assess not just the idea of Muslims as rulers or as Sufis, but actually Muslims as participants of a project of thinking together about the subcontinent, thinking together with the kind of cultural markers, thinking together with the political powers, thinking together in the social milieu. And these sets of historians, especially people like Shafat Ahmed Khan, they saw with clarity the arc of history tilting in the subcontinent toward violence. They saw it with extreme clarity. They stood out and they spoke about it. As early as 1920, as late as 1935, they were able to say that the project of history telling that is at play in these years of the 20th century will lead to extreme violence, would lead to dispossession of people, which ends up happening. Across the subcontinent, we now confront a crisis of the past with an explicit understanding of difference as destiny. The majorities of the subcontinent have accumulated power to govern, and they have condemned the minorities to be marginalized or to be expunged. The majoritarians believe that this current state of exception, where one's religion and linguistic heritage determine belonging and exclusion, whether in Pakistan, in India, or Bangladesh, is the rule. That's the norm. The majoritarian Sunni or Hindutva projects ask that we as historians consider them inevitable or immutable. Yet this cannot stand. It is instructive for us to re-engage with the history, with the urgency with which Shafat Ahmed Khan laid out the collective intellectual project facing the colonized historian in 1935. While we face differently articulated versions in majoritarian readings of the medieval, we ought to recognize the same sense of despair, the same urgency to take collective action in the face of majoritarian claims on the past. So that's basically kind of the methodological and perhaps ethical formulations of the project that I have undertaken. I want to end my comments today by doing a pranam to my teachers, those who taught me how to think about Hindustan, and whose writings and whose engagement with the history that I am getting wrong, I'm sure, in this book. Regardless, that debt is a debt that I carry, and I'm extremely, extremely, extremely happy to acknowledge it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manan. I'll have Keshav unmute everyone now, and Manan, you're okay with taking questions? I have a few people who've already raised their hands. So we'll start with a few. I have a queue. If you'd like to ask a question, just message me and I'll put you in the queue. I want to start with Anya Lumba, who is in the audience. Please turn on your lovely faces. But before we do that,
I have.
1 second, people, if we could just give Manan a taliyan. I forgot to do the most important part. Turn on your speaker so he can hear you across. So much, Manan. That was wonderful.
You're brilliant.
Woo! Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay, Anya, take it away.
Yeah. But now I can't see Manan.
I'm right here.
Oh, hi. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk, which went in a different direction from what I thought it might be doing at the very beginning. And as an early modernist, but working on European history and historians, I'm just curious. Firstly, I just have a practical, intuitive, silly question, which is, do you think that your author might have read Leo Africanus? And who's also writing a geographical history of Africa, which is traveling. And the reason I ask this is that Africanus seems to follow, I haven't read Tarikhi, but he seems to follow that pattern that Africanus is putting into place, which is that it's not a country and it's not a world history. And here I'm thinking of Sanjay Subramaniam's argument that people are writing world histories in the 16th century and, and Sanjay Subramaniam puts in that article or in that work, he's criticizing, the post-colonialist view, Dipesh in particular, I think, although he doesn't really say that very clearly, but this idea that history writing is something which is only an attribute of the West. So, I mean, you're proving, of course, giving yet another example of why that is not true. But I wondered what models, are there models that Tarikhi has, which might be coming from elsewhere? Is he engaging? I was curious about his own reading. So I'm taking you away from the British colonial history to an earlier history of contact that I'm very interested in, because that tangentially, of course, allows us to think about colonialism in a slightly different way, not just the 19th century colonialism, but an earlier, more complicated history of what might be thought of as proto-colonial, if we like.
Thank you, Professor Lumba. That's a very generous question. The short answer is that I have no indication that he would have read Leo Africanus. or Ibn Khaldun, who Leo Africanus draws upon for his understanding. A kind of idea of history writing that is to say meta history or theoretical historiographical thinking about history that Farishta engages in could very well come through Ibn Khaldun. If it does, there are a lot of translations from Arabic into Persian, excerpts that are happening, and he certainly has access to them. He doesn't cite Khaldun, so I can't answer that question. But one can assume that there are analogs that are coming from people, from other historians that he would be familiar with, but not Leo Africanus, I don't think so.
Okay. But the pattern seems fascinating, which is not a nation and not another sort of, it's wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Manan, I'm going to take my moderator's privilege and ask a question before I turn it over to Audrey. So Audrey, please bear with me, if you will. My question is, I'm going to ventriloquize Indrani Chatterjee here a little bit and sort of ask, not the vulgar gender question, right, which is, this is a boy's history, which I think, is evidently clear, but more complicatedly an epistemological question about sources, lineages, mappings, right? So even the first sort of divergent history you showed us of Farishta, where he sort of looks at different regions from Sindh, Gujarat, I was looking through it, it's still a lineage of kings and rulers and hegemonic forms. And one of the projects that Indrani's Forgotten Friends does, albeit it's temporally later, and it's about the Brahmaputra Valley, is to ask us to think more capaciously about the forms we recuperate, right? So I wanted to sort of hear your thoughts a little bit, because you brought up infrastructure, you brought up archive, you brought up accumulation, you brought about citational translation, and all of it is about making something cohere as a source text out of which we write histories, albeit alternative histories. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because I'm sure there is more of that. And then just one comment, Farishta, of course, as everyone here knows, is angel, right, also. So this is a kind of a different Benjaminian angel of history, which I think we would happily sign up for more than the other. But anyway, so whatever you fancy, Manan, and then I'll turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you, Professor Andekar. Let's see, I think, so yes, in that table of contents that I showed you that Farishta writes for his text, he has regions and then he has, the various kings. But in the content of each section, if you want to call them, or book, the lives of the kings are not the dominant kind of organizing principle for the text. In fact, Farishta's eye as a historian is largely towards that which requires assimilation, precisely because it doesn't fit the narrative that previous historians had sent. So things that are incurable in his view, that his historian ancestors had required, he focuses on those things in order to kind of think with them. Sometimes he resolves them, sometimes he does not resolve them. Sometimes he is able to actually basically put a version that comes to dominate popular imagination later on, but does not comport with what other historians of his time are doing. A lot of transgressive acts and a lot of transgressive politics enters Farishta's narrative through these types of accounts. And I tried my best to call attention to them in the book. But it's a synthetic history. He's trying to reconcile things. What's different is that he's trying to reconcile things that other historians have no interest in reconciling. And so that's what makes it a little bit more, more powerful, according. And in terms of Professor Chatterjee's kind of thinking about infrastructure, infrastructure. What was I saying? Yes, he does have a couple of specific chapters that in his text, which again, I don't do much with for reasons of my own limitations, where he talks about the Sufi brotherhoods and the Sufi infrastructure and the caregiving that also organizes space. And so it's there in the text, it's not in my book.
Thank you, Manan. That was a very generous response to my meandering question. Audrey is somewhere and you're next. There you are, Audrey. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Manan, for this talk. It was great. The book is excellent. I love it. So I wanted to ask you, like when you said like a quibble, so I have a quibble. How innovative do you think that Firishta really is, especially regarding his concept of Hindustan? At least as I read your book, I think you do a great job showing that he's very innovative regarding, sort of older Hindu stories and how he incorporates them and so on and so forth. But and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you also suggest that he sort of builds on sort of 700 years of historiography concerning Hindustan. And you use the term in your talk just now that he crystallizes that sort of set of views. I wonder if is he really just crystallizing? Is he not sort of strongly innovating? Sort of what would your thoughts be on that?
Thank you, Audrey. I mean, innovation is a tricky double-edged sword. You can live with it and then you die by it too. I choose not to do either. But I think it's important to understand that while he is drawing upon a long tradition, so it's in no way that Firishta is kind of coming up with a particular understanding of Hindustan. He's not interested in that kind of project. He is interested in and very explicit about saying that he's going to write a new type of history. So it's not Hindustan that is the new thing. It's the history that he's writing, the ethics of it, the mood of it, the rasa of it, the comportment of it, the way that he imagines it to live in the world. Now, he's very, very adamant about that. And he's adamant about in the kind of formal ways in which he kind of does citational practices, in descriptive ways in which, unlike other historians, he actually describes his journeys to someone's libraries. He says, I would like to throw that librarian down the stairs because he's such an idiot and wouldn't give me, the book that I want to see. So those things are innovative, as in we are seeing the, things that a historian has to do in order to write the narrative that he wants to write. He's also innovative in that his rasa shifts over the course of the book. The book ends with anger and despair. Anger at, your friends, the Mughals, not coming and saving Hindustan. Anger at the Portuguese for doing what they're doing to his Hindustan. Recognition. So I talked about the recognition that the historians had in 1925 and 1935 to the colonial ordering of knowledge. Firishta very much has a recognition in his text in the early part of 17th century that the world that is unfolding before him will actually end the world that he is in right now. And that this is not an event that is the comportment of Europeans is not an event that can be left unchallenged or unremarked upon. And I do find that very, very important, very, very innovative. We actually can fast forward to Sir al-Mutakhirin, and other texts that are written in the 18th century, and find a lack of engagement with that kind of affect for the historian. So to splice the quibble, no on Hindustan, yes on history writing. I hope that helps.
It's always great to see a quibble between historians because it seems like that's all y'all do. But anyway, I'm joking. We have many, many people who are on the list, so I'll try to get to everyone in the time that we have. I have Zirvat next. I don't know where Zirvat is. Zirvat?
No.
Okay, go for it.
Hi, Manan. How are you? Thank you.
Good to see you.
Virtual embrace. We have a few minority Bangladeshis in our audience, which we need to acknowledge.
Oh my God. You don't have to declare it to the world.
Because India is a hegemonic.
I heard that. I heard that.
Anyway, please, I'm distracting you from your question. Go ahead.
All right.
Okay.
Here we go.
So Manan, I wanted to ask you about just the term Hindustan itself, especially given that I spend my days with the colonial historians that you talked about, especially in the 18th century. And they always preface their descriptions of Hindustan with Lendu and the Indus, and like it's a kind of riverine landscape. And I wanted to ask you where landscape fits within this Hindustan that, you know, I really admire you for not trying to recuperate it, but understand where, you know, what were its own meandering journeys as well. And I bring it up because in my work, I've always been fascinated by this sort of incongruity of the expression, at least the way the British colonialists are explaining it, Hindustan, like a place of a river, especially given that the logic of a river is to defy place through its changing of course. So I'm just wondering where, you know, maybe this is a different way to kind of pivot, you know, Audrey's question from earlier, but, you know, where does place, especially, you know, where does place, especially given what becomes of it in terms of property and land formation, where does that exist in your imagination of Hindustan?
Thank you, Zerva. So I have a fascination with place and space, and it's very much a part of how I think as a historian. And so it was quite difficult for me. I have the chapter in which I kind of think about the place of Hindustan and think about all the various spatial categories that are in Sanskrit, that are in Arabic, that are in Persian, and then in Dutch and German and French and English imagination. So in that chapter, I kind of go through these various modalities of placemaking. And my struggle, if I can confess, was that Hindustan had a rigidity to it from the earliest sources, which was very much kind of Himalayas through, you know, contemporary Sri Lanka, Kabul to, you know, the Delta, the Bengal Delta. You know, nobody seemed to have any doubts, you know, this is the comportment of the subcontinent, and the subcontinent has that. And so the rivers that were at play were the Amu Darya that you cross in order to enter Hindustan. Not the ones that the British kind of imagine dividing the North and the South, and where the ocean surrounds the subcontinent, right? All three sides. So my struggle, or my conceptual struggle, was that I could see in these sources this kind of clarity, and I could also see that Hindustan as a polity was contested by different types of imagination, by different types of political imagination. So rulers who would like to claim the title of Shahanshah Hindustan would want their political control and the geographic spatial categories to be as closely attuned as possible. Babur had to do the most of this heavy lifting in this. He had to kind of figure out how to be the ruler of Hindustan, the Shahanshah of Hindustan, while also acknowledging that he wasn't really the ruler of the entire subcontinent. So that's a little bit of mental gymnastics that he had to do. But I think by the time the Europeans are entering into this conversation, they enter it first through the text, and the text that they enter it through is Abul Fazl's Akbarnama. So what happens with that is that that's a polity's claim of space. And the polity's claim of space becomes tied to the European understanding of the place. And as that polity shrinks, or their claim to it shrinks, the Europeans are able to kind of disaggregate the various parts of Hindustan. So as late as 1790, 1800, there is debate. So the royal geographer in charge, whatever, Robert Orme, for example, insists that Hindustan is north and south. By the time we see James Mill, 1805, he's like, this is nonsense. We have a river that divides it. So this is a lot of it is kind of how these Persian histories are excerpted and rethought in the realm of the political for the European powers. I hope that answers it. But if you're looking at like the earlier histories, it is there. I do cover it in the book.
That was actually a really useful elucidation for me too, because I was thinking about some of the same terrains, Irvad. So thank you. I have many other people. I'm going to turn to Nasheen Ali. I don't know where you are. I don't see you. If you, oh, there you are.
Right here. Yes.
Please.
Hi. Congrats, Manan. This was
Hi,
fantastic. And so many questions actually. But just, I was wondering if you could tell us more. I'm very curious about the people chapter. Aapne jo index dikhaya shuru mein. What is the religious imagination in Farishta? You say that wo Mahabharat se trace karte hai. He has this way, some kind of cosmology in which he's integrating. I think you also use the word synthetic. What is novel, what is innovative. But I'm just curious, is he covering rituals? Is he covering beliefs? What does Hindustan look like at a social level for him?
Thank you, Nasheen. That's a great question. So the people chapter was very, very fun to write, I must admit. It allowed me to kind of think a little bit about some of these issues that as historians of the pre-modern we always face, which is social history questions. How do we kind of get to something other than one dude and something he carved into a stone? There are a lot of troublemakers in Farishta's peopling. Farishta is drawn to those who transgress or who have to be assimilated. Assimilated here means their heads may be cut off, or they may, withdraw into a cave, whatever the case may be. He has sympathies with them. So he will describe, accounts of pirates. He will describe accounts of false prophets. He would describe accounts of Sufis who are really good chefs. War injuries, rituals for healing. He's a physician as well. He writes a text on basically war wounds, how to heal war wounds. I don't cover that text in my book, but I'd read it and it's insane. He has a cure for if someone cuts half of your neck off, which, like if that's a thing that I ever find myself in, I'll have a recipe now for it.
Handy for Pakistan and India these days. We better get equipped with this work.
That's some dark humor. Okay, so, but just to answer your direct question, I think the People's chapter does allow us to think of the social world outside of the kind of royal images, royal courts, or even the Sufi Khanikas. He does have, Sufis and yogis and all these kinds of more traditional as in things of interest to historians. But what I find best is, most interesting, so this is my prejudice, most interesting were these accounts of people who basically, he says, I don't know the full name, but people in the street calls him like Ballu, and here's Ballu's story. And I appreciated that. Nice. I tried to include some of them in my People's chapter, obviously not many, but yes, that's the kind of stuff that's there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And Nasheen, I appreciate your warning of what we should do in across the borders in preparation, in case we run across similar stories. I have three people. I'm going to turn to my colleague Bali Sahota, who has a question. Bali, where are you? There you go. Go ahead.
Hello, Manan, long time.
Save the love for later. Let's talk to the...
Look forward to reading your book. It's probably a little too late for these questions, but I'll ask them because I think they might be coming your way with reviews and critiques and what have you. But I was wondering, about whether the Euro-India divide itself is not a part of the colonial episteme, because that's a question that Fanon brings up. And so in his attempts to sort of break out of the colonial sort of mold, he begins to sort of question the divide between Europe and Africa, and doesn't think of that as a very sort of worthwhile model to keep in mind. And also I was wondering if translating Tariq so instantly into history, or considering it as a historical genre, may not be following in the footsteps of figures like Dao himself. So, what does it mean to think of the specificity of this genre, which, is associated with a date or chronology, also with something like, the Abrahamic theological worldview, right? This is what I think is indicated by Ibrahimi. And so that is not really in keeping with anything like, something like a modern historical sort of, episteme, if you want to use that terminology.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you, Bali. I think Dao and what comes after and the discipline of history are not where Farishta himself is engaged in, and neither do I put him in that conversation. So my work is not trying to argue for Farishta as some kind of proto-historian or some kind of figure that the discipline of history needs to take on in that sense. The argument for how Farishta conceives of what the historical text is, or what is the text that he's writing, and what how to kind of enter into it, and what to do with it, and what to include in it, what not to include in it, is a project that I feel I'm very careful in tracing. So when I read what Farishta is reading and citing, I go read those texts, and in those texts, I say, what is the kind of meta narrative that author is engaging in? So what does Juzjani in the 13th century say that he's doing when he's writing his Tariq? What does someone like Nizamuddin Ahmed think he's doing when he's writing this? So I read in my the History of Hindustan chapter, I actually read these meta commentaries from a range of histories, tariqs, that from 13th century all the way to Farishta's contemporaries, in order to see what is the task of history writing that is being imagined. And it's absolutely, you're correct, it's not one definition. Different historians are entering into that genre in different ways, if it's a genre. We want to think of along, Foucauldian categories of ordering of knowledge. So Farishta allows me to think of a comity of intellectuals that he's joining very, I want to say, consciously. Now, what happens with the rendition of Dao, of Farishta as a history of Hindustan, is, again, to pick up your point, that text enters immediately the discipline making of history itself. So that's the moment in which the philosophy of history is being written, right? So you immediately, the Farishta, the rendition of Dao immediately enters at what constitutes Weltgeschichte, right? And how do we kind of normalize all of the regions that have a history and hence can be constituted under this system, and those who don't, such as Africa, have to be put aside. And so the Dao's renditions that enter this domain, if you look at the footnotes I did for Herder and for Hegel and how they're citing it, they actually, it's funny, they cite Dao, right? So they don't say Farishta da, even though the text is Farishtas. They're always very carefully to cite Dao or to Briggs or to any of the kind of renditions that they're using in their work. So the task of making of a philosophy of history, even though Farishta is in the footnotes of them, he's once removed. And the project that Farishta himself was engaged in, and the project that I trace to the 19th century historians, is not something that enters Europe in any way, shape, or form through this intellectual size. So there is a division here within a stream of historical thinking and historiography that one can see. And I'll just basically end with a statement that for the 19th century historians writing during colonial period, one can see what happens to the historian who writes in Urdu or in Hindi or even in Marathi, and what happens to those who are writing in English. Same time period, right? So we can look at literally Jadunath Sarkar, and next to Jadunath Sarkar, we can put Zakaullah, or we can put Shibli. And we can see what enters the domain of historical thinking and what doesn't. And in a previous work, I call these quarantine histories. There are histories that basically get subsumed under a kind of worldview that does not allow them to be taken up, even though those authors are like, here's a footnote, here's an appendix, here's a bibliography, here's a citation. I will cite Ranke because you like Ranke. I think he's an idiot, but I'm going to cite him. So even though they're trying to do what disciplinary history asks of them, they are not constituted in disciplinary history. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Manan. I think we have 3 more people in the queue, and then I'm going to say give Manan the day off. I think he's been working very hard for us. So I have my wonderful colleague Junaid. Junaid, Marathi मध्ये प्रश्न विचारणार आहे. Manan, तू तयार आहेस ना?
Sure.
You mentioned Jadunath Sarkar, who Maharashtrian historians of Dalit histories do not like. So that's why I wanted to throw in that. Junaid, please take it away.
I'm not standing up for him. I'm sure there's some Bengalis in this audience.
Hi, Manan. Thank you for that lovely talk. The way I was reading the talk was the histories of modern nationalism, particularly the borders that are then drawn in the 20th century. That makes Hindustan a fragment. And then you go take it as your task to go and retrieve that fragment through colonial archives. And then you burn through the delicious cake, eat up the delicious cake. And then you come down and then you retrieve a history of Hindustan. I'm thinking aloud here. I was wondering, what if the loss of Hindustan is an overstatement, right? Or was there another way of retrieving this history of Hindustan? Right. Through through memory, etc., all that, which you have done, of course, before, right? So no, I'm thinking aloud, so I'm just throwing it out there. Yeah.
Thank you. How do I say this? Do I wish the loss of Hindustan is an overstatement? I kind of want to wish it, but I feel that it's not an overstatement. Let me go back to one of the key reasons that I don't do some of the work that my teachers do. So I showed, perhaps people weren't able to see, or maybe not. At the end, I dedicate my book to 3 of my teachers. They're not the only 3 teachers I hold in extreme esteem, but they're the 3 that I wanted to mention in this project, which is C.M. Naeem, who, as many of you may know, is a scholar of Urdu literature. Muzaffar Alam, who is a scholar of medieval history, late Mughal, 18th century Mughal history. And Shahid Amin, who is a scholar of modern South Asia. And the reason that I kept thinking about their work throughout my writing is I'm not doing anything any of them do. And all of them actually do some of the things that you're talking about. They think about memory. They think about anecdotes and literary readings. They think about the kind of the heartland, right? The Mughal heartland through which we can think of something. This book is doing none of those things. So part of the reason I dedicated this book to them was I don't want them to flip out on me. I'm hoping that this does the job. But part of it is that I actually I am different as a historian from those projects. And as an intellectual historian, I wanted to think very critically about the philosophy of history that I was entering as a domain. And a version of this book was actually spending a lot more time thinking with Hegel and Fanon. But I ended up not doing it for other reasons. But I think in your question actually does your question thankfully allows me to reflect very clearly that this project is unlike the project that I was trained in as a graduate student and I read. And it's a difficult project precisely because I think there are other answers possible. Absolutely. You, like I said, music, you know, the kavya genre, I'm thinking here of my dear late friend, Alison Bush. I'm thinking about Kavita Datla. I'm thinking about all these scholars that are very much a part of me, but who would answer this question from very different ways than I ended up answering. I basically drew a very, very close circle around the project of history writing itself and tried to answer it from there, with the hope that if this difficult thing, if I'm able to pull it off, then it opens up broader venues for pursuing the other projects that you're mentioning. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Junaid. That was a great question. And I think also helped at least helped me think about other historical forms that congeal around these languages of loss and region. I have two more people on the list, and Nivedita Bobai, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your surname. Is Nivedita here?
Yeah, good morning. This is Nivedita Bobal.
Acha, Bobal. I have it as Bobai. Sorry, Bobal.
Yes, it's okay. So, good morning, sir. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned a couple of names. Most of the libraries are in Europe that you mentioned have the first manuscripts of the early manuscripts of the Farishte book. Are any of the editions still available in India? How much has the colonial era actually ruined us in the knowledge sphere?
Thank you, Nivedita. I mean, I think they've ruined us in the knowledge sphere pretty comprehensively. But as far as the Farishta manuscripts are concerned, there are still manuscripts in Rampur and in Aligarh, because a lot of editions of Farishta were produced in the 19th century. Lithographs were produced in the 19th century. And so Farishta is constantly being recopied. And of course, in Osmania and in Calcutta. So there are many manuscripts of Farishta available, but the ones that I pointed out in my slide are some of the earliest ones, or the ones that are from the 17th and early 18th century, that happen to be collected because they were sought out by the colonial officials, some of whom I mentioned. So in other words, there's a critical edition of Farishta that was produced from Tehran, and the critical edition is made out of 9 manuscripts that are, 3 of them are in India and the rest 6 are in Europe. And I basically use that for my actual work. But I looked at all of these different manuscripts, as many of these different manuscripts as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Manan.
Thank you, sir.
We have one more question from Sarah Kidwai. Sarah, are you here?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, please go ahead.
Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you. And, you know, I'm in that position where you've written a book relevant for my thesis as I'm writing. So
Make sure you thank him. Make sure you thank him like he thanked his teachers. So
yeah. I follow him on Twitter too. So thank you for all the time you do. I know I have a difficult job of the last question. So I'm hoping it opens up a broader conversation rather than ending it here. And you know my work, it's taking for Syed Ahmed Khan as a popularizer of science. And so while he's working on all these historical documents, I actually have it right at my desk. He's also working on scientific manuals. And so my question is, you mentioned, you know, Delhi College, Maulvi Zakaullah, all these people are also not only grappling with historical writing, but also the loss of scientific knowledge that was held in the past. So my question is more of interdisciplinary. What does this historical writing genre leave out? And I do know that like scientists, history of science gets left out in this, but also on the other hand, you have history of science where your work would be non-existent. So how do we reconcile with the legacy we have of area studies while we're trying to do all this work in a sort of vacuum? I know it's a really broad question, but I'm just trying to grapple with how we've lost a lot of these figures in 19th century history of science, and writing them back in, it's a broad question. So thank you for your work. And I want to leave you with that broad question of history writing and scientific knowledge.
Thank you, Sarah. I love your paper on Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and I'm looking forward to your dissertation. As you know, Zakaullah is a mathematician. He actually makes his living teaching math. Farishta is a doctor, writes a Tibbi, a manuscript on Tib. So there's a version of my book, which is literally a historian of science would write, that would simply be about, the genre of history of science, and would not enter into the kind of discursive spaces that I'm entering as an intellectual historian on this side of the aisle, so to speak. I think to pick up the comment that you began with, which is people like Sayyid Ahmad Khan in their scientific or their medical juridical work, or Zakaullah, who are engaged in kind of thinking about science and history as a science alongside these other kind of disciplines like mathematics, astronomy, and chemistry, etc. How do we reintegrate them into the kind of intellectual world that we can make of Hindustan? I think it's a terrific question. I think part of the kind of problem we face as a field is that the attention to these particular individuals in the mid to late 19th century, Muslim intellectuals who are writing on science, has been very, very rare, or very, very, feeble in kind of. So Zakaullah is a great example. So, I mean, my counting, and I just looked at him very briefly, he has something like 30 different kind of mathematics and scientific translation texts. Never, ever, ever encountered them in secondary historiography, ever. Zakaullah is basically known as a shitty historian. That's it. Derivative work, just summarizes Gora's. So, I think we need work such as what you're doing to kind of help us reframe some of these epistemic categories and integrate. I would put literary writing, literary studies, literature, scholars of literature alongside scholars of history of science to, so people who can write on Scherer as a novelist or as a historical fiction, put these intellectuals who are producing in all these different genres as part of the same kind of category. I mean, we can see some of this work for, I will pay my respect to my colleagues from Bengal who've been doing this for many, many years, kind of thinking about intellectuals in a complex way in different genres, but hasn't been done for, I think, Urdu, and certainly not the types of work that I've read. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Sarah. I look forward to reading your work as well. I wanted to end with just a couple of comments. Firstly, a big shukriya to Manan for spending his evening and assuming bedtime with us. Shabak Khair will happen in just a second. But before that, I wanted to say that, what I like and what I've found immensely provocative about Manan's work, and I'm an intellectual historian of gender and sexuality, trained in literary studies, working in historical archives, I think is your mandate to think concept histories. So I think the argument that you make about Hindustan is one that I encountered when I was in Pakistan, talking about sexuality and gender and understanding the kind of diversity of genealogies that has been supplanted by the post-colonialist history that I think you were critiquing. And also a phrase that Goan historians use a lot to talk about Indian history as a colony of a post-colony. So I think it's another thing to add to your listening. I want to thank all of you for spending your Diwali with us. I wanted to say Eid Mubarak in the beginning, and I remembered it was Diwali, but it's Mubarak time for us. And Umeed Kayam hai. I hope there will be regime change across South Asia. I hope Imran Khan goes back to playing cricket. I hope Modi goes back to being a chaiwala. One can always aspire. And please join us again for our next events. I look forward to seeing you all, and have a lovely and peaceful rest of the year. Thank you again. And a big round of applause, everybody. Thank you so much.